No.
Hello and welcome to Hello and welcome to Champions of Psychology, a show with the goal of openly talking about mental health and gaming, presented by Codename Entertainment and TakeThis.org. Every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on twitch.tv/CNE Games, or later on your favorite podcast service, Mitra Jordan and Raffael Boccamazzo, aka Dr. B, talk about mental health in these unprecedented times, as well as how gaming affects us. If you're here with us live in the chat, you can leave a question that I, Treavor Bettis, might ask them later in the show. But our topic today is play as a form of learning. But before we get to that, Mitra, Dr. B, who are you for the fine people who may not know?
So I'm Mitra Jordan. I work as a therapist in Victoria, British Columbia, and I love using games in my work. So I guess that covers it.
I am Raffael Boccamazzo, aka Dr. B. I'm the clinical director over at TakeThis.org. And I don't see clients anymore. I do nothing but policy and education these days, but I am clinically trained, and I do a lot of stuff around tabletop RPGs. So today is just like my jam, talking about play as an adult, because I feel like it's my whole career now.
yeah, it has something to do in there. For sure.
A little bit. Just a little bit.
Just a little.
Just a teensy bit. And speaking of which, why don't we start off with what we're defining play as here?
Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds like a great plan.
Okay, well, I'm not the go-to guy on this. You're both looking at me, and I'm just like,
No.
I don't know these things. I got dice.
Well, you know how to play, which is a big part of it. So I say, Dr. B, this is
for me to do. Well, so play is silliness. I mean, in and of itself, it is a sort of free-form expression of an idea and creativity that we often do as children, just developmentally. I mean, so many of us make up games as kids where we're often practicing social roles, or we're just being silly, and we don't do that as adults generally.
Yeah, so we're harnessing imagination and creativity and what if to try things out. And most important, to take risks, because unless you take risks, you don't learn. So, and the risk you're taking is with failure, but if you're playing, you're not really worried about making mistakes and failing, which is why learning is so effective through the lens of play. And kids do this pretty naturally, and as adults, we tend to worry more about failure and sometimes even experience some shame and mortification, which we'll get into.
Yes.
Yeah, something people are judging me.
Exactly. And that really interferes with our ability to not just start playing, but to keep playing, or to decide that play and games are for us, because we may make judgments about, I'm not good at that. And then we kind of disown that part of ourselves. So.
Okay. So that's what we're mainly talking about here as far as the play itself, but learning from it. One of the things that we talked about yesterday was challenges in understanding the game, kind of starting off there. What challenges, because you were saying there's like the embarrassment and whatnot, is that one of the challenges to get over to do the play, or where are we going with that?
So for me, I think it comes from that place of learning and feeling comfortable with oneself as a person who can engage socially with others, and be safe to take risks and have fun and be silly. And there are a number of things that can really interfere with this. And one of them is, how safe do I feel, right? In a group setting, say. So kid starts in kindergarten and then they experience, maybe some judgment from other kids, or maybe a little bit of, maybe it's not even bullying, but just a little name calling or something. And then feeling less safe in the environment completely interferes with being able to even play out in the playground or just play imaginative, I have a teddy here or a stuffed toy of some sort, and you've got yours, and they're going to set up a house together. And just being able to let go and be in that environment requires feeling safe. So from our very littlest selves, we can experience challenges to just being able to let go and play spontaneously.
And it's magnified as an adult. Like one of the things I periodically do is I train clinicians and teachers on the applied use of role-playing games in clinical and learning settings. And one part of the model that Dr. Megan Connell and I developed for the application of this stuff relies on this idea that as an adult, you have to be able to just freely engage in play, and that you have to be able to model that, because it's really interesting to see adults loosen up about this at the gaming table. Mm-hmm. Because just as an adult, I don't get silly. I don't do this sort of thing. But if you've got a DM, GM, or whoever who's leading this, and they are just getting into the game with wild abandon, mm-hmm. you're creating a safer space to do that. And it's really cool to watch a group of adults maybe who have never played a role-playing game before kind of loosen up with that and get into this idea that I can be safe being completely silly here. Mm-hmm. Just try on new things, try on new ways of being, like I'm exchanging hats, or exchanging, in my case, vests and ties. Well, and hats too, but
yeah, can't forget the hats.
No, can't forget the
cannot
hats.
forget them.
So one of the things, like, I'm not going to name names here, but like I have experienced what you guys are talking about with somebody I know, where I was trying to teach a group of people D&D, and I was saying, like, oh, it's basically setting up a hypothetical. I'm saying, this is the situation you're in. How would you react to it? And one of the people was just like, I don't do hypotheticals. And I'm like, I mean, you just put a hard stop to this. Like, I can't go anywhere from here. But what do you think? This is actually something that we didn't talk about in our meeting that just kind of popped in my head. What do you think the difference is for some people between this version of play, specifically towards learning, like, they can get into that different mindset and whatnot, versus them playing a video game and being completely fine with getting immersed into that? Like, I know people who play role-playing games, like, they are obsessed with Mass Effect, but they can't get into a role-playing game at the table. Is it that level of, like, embarrassment of people seeing you and stuff, do you think?
I think it's partly also I think that may be a piece of it, for sure. And then the other thing is the framework. Like, even in fairly open online role-playing games, right? And I'm thinking about, the more sandbox style games. There's still a structure. Mm-hmm. There's still quests that you're given. There's still things you can do. Now, you can get into some challenging interactions around, say, dungeons or raids or fights that you're supposed to do in a group. Where if you're not stepping up and doing your part, you can get into challenges. Or if you don't know, like, this always happened to me in WoW. Like, I always took on healing roles, and I'm actually I think of myself as a fairly good healer. Thank you very much. But
well, I mean, you made a career out of it.
It's true,
right? But I am terrible as a wayfinder, like, in life. And I remember reading wayfinding, by the way, is about directions and maps and knowing where you are in space. And that is not a strength. Like, I can get lost going through point A to point B, and my kids routinely notice this about me. I'll, like, make a left turn. No, bad idea. I'll get lost in familiar environments. So you can just imagine going into some kind of twisty turny environment in a game, and healer would be nowhere to be found. People would die. It'd be bad. I'd get kicked. And so there was a lot of mortification around that. So you can get into mortification in online spaces, for sure. But I do think a big piece of it is the structure that's being provided. And I'm responding within, like, there's fewer options. And so I'm responding, do I take this quest? Don't I take this quest? So whereas it's so open at the table,
Yeah.
right? And that can, what we talk about in therapy as well is containment, right? Creating a structure that feels safe. So at the table, how do you create something for people to hold on to?
Mm.
So that they either really know their character well, or they kind of have a sense of their spells or their options or the fight, like just to kind of narrow it down a little for them to start with. And then as the game progresses, you can open it way up,
Mm-hmm.
you know. But when you say kind of like, sky's the limit, do what you want, kind of thing, it freaks people out, especially if they're new to the game.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, overwhelmed by choices
Yeah.
is a good way of putting it.
That's why I didn't finish
With it,
Witcher 3.
what's that?
That's why I didn't finish Witcher 3.
See, and I was okay
Oh.
with Witcher 3 because even within Witcher 3, if you think about it, with like video game RPGs, like Mitra said, there's a framework, there's forced
Mm-hmm.
choice. All
Mm-hmm.
right. There's only so many dialogue options. It's not like you can, in Witcher 3, if Geralt is approached with something, you can't type in option C, here's my response, and the game responds appropriately. You just can't do
Mm-hmm.
that. But when it comes to more free form varieties of play, whether it's LARPing, whether it's tabletop RPGs, whether it's even as something, because tabletop RPGs are essentially improv,
Mm-hmm.
just with a little bit of a different framework to it. It to sort of take a semi-related tangent, it takes time to build up trust at the table
Mm-hmm.
to be more open and take character chances. That's why I'm always an advocate of a good session zero.
Mm-hmm.
Just like in a therapy session, it helps develop that framework. But yeah, that being sort of overwhelmed by open-ended options is a thing that when I teach people how to do tabletop RPGs for the first time, the first time I ask them, what do you do? They're like, what can I do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anything. Just make a choice like you would in real life. Okay, I'm gonna give you some options,
Yeah.
and just start from there until they get more into it and they figure out that they can just use their imagination. It's
Mm-hmm.
just not something we do as adults. Just use our imaginations freely.
Yeah, we might not really understand what our options are if we're not that familiar with the game or how to play, right? Because there is this component of how to play, right? And how to play is actually quite culturally defined, you know?
Mm.
And so I was just, we'll get into that later in the conversation, of course, but I was thinking just about if I'm unfamiliar with a setting and I'm unfamiliar with the people, that session zero is pretty crucial. And the other piece that's really helpful about a session zero is actually consent. Where do we feel comfortable going?
Yep.
What kind of material are we comfortable working with? What might actually be traumatic for us in some way? And I think people get a little bit lost in this idea of people maybe being too sensitive or trigger warnings, and all this kind of these kinds of conversations that we're starting to have more now in terms of people's comfort and safety. But nobody's going to have a good time at the table if someone isn't feeling comfortable or safe. It just is going to interfere with everyone's comfort and sense of
Mm-hmm.
safety. So
Yeah, and that's a really good point, that everybody feeling safe and having that sense of trust at the table really benefits everyone else.
yeah.
Because I think we've all been there, probably, those of us who have been playing tabletop role playing games for years, or in some cases decades. But the when somebody is having a bad time at the table,
Hmm.
there is this sort of nebulous, at best, nebulous discomfort that the other players don't know what to do with. And creating that framework in that session zero, because it's a very interesting thing to know, here are the limits of what I can do, and here or here I don't know where the limits are. They're very different scenarios, and I, just speaking for me, I definitely like to know where my limits are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I really do, because then I have the framework. I'm trying not to overuse that term, but it's a really crucial term.
Yeah.
I have the framework within which I can explore.
Okay.
Yeah, and that framework can for sure get broader with time. As people get more comfortable with each other and more familiar with each other's play style, then we can start to take more risks in the game. We can not be as afraid of making mistakes. And we also get to know, the GM or DM better, and that also helps in terms of figuring out how we're going to play. So,
Okay. So, what are some of the ways that play can be used as learning? Because I know recently we talked last week a couple of ways that this was. Like I mentioned that I know someone who is trans and they used tabletop RPGs as a way to explore that at the table with their friends in a safe setting.
mhm.
What are some ways that it's used like that?
I've seen that all the time. I mean, back when I ran social skills groups for teenagers
Mm-hmm.
using role playing games, I saw that all the time. Gender exploration. A number of the kids I worked with, um, yeah, I mean, it was super common to see
Mm-hmm.
that sort of thing. But for myself, I mention this every show. I'm autistic, and not fitting in as a kid socially. Long before I had a diagnosis of autism, I was using games to essentially practice social skills. All the characters I played were socially competent. They
Mm-hmm.
were charismatic. And after 10 years of playing characters like that, I had this epiphany that if I could do that at the table, I could do that IRL. So um, it, it becomes a safe space in which not only to practice identity aspects, but also very specific skills.
Absolutely. And it's a because D&D and much gaming really can involve a form of improv. As we start to feel more comfortable, we can take risks with who we are, or we can be more comfortable with who we are. And you hear of people who are like really comfortable with their close friends, but
Mm-hmm.
shy, right? Feeling anxiety or social discomfort in other settings. But that ability to be slightly larger than life or a lot larger than life and have fun and try something new can really start to infuse your life outside of games. And I think at one point I may have brought up the example of somebody I met in World of Warcraft who was just the life of the party in our guild. But then outside of the guild, it turned out they were really struggling. But then as we talked more and as kind of they got that reflection from me and other people in the guild of how amazing they were and how much fun they were and how much liveliness and energy they brought to our group. And then they and I had specifically talked about, how do you bring that into your life? And so we can leverage the qualities that we discover in ourselves in play settings into our broader life and the way we are with people. And that makes such a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So,
I don't know if I talked about on the show. I never talked with the two of you, but like one of the ways that I have the personality that I did was I got into tabletop RPGs late. I found this personality from playing Halo 2 online and just
mm,
only having voice and audio to go off of. So it just and because like these aren't the people I go to school with, I can just leave the party chat or whatever. I just tried out personalities and to see what works. I do something. I'm like, okay, no, that didn't work. The entire party quit.
You
um,
You're basically describing my teen and my early 20s, my teen years, my early 20s, where I have a very dear friend in the game industry who's an incredibly talented narrative designer, and she's autistic.
mhm.
And she and I talk about the fact that the reason she's so good at narrative design is that she and I think of dialogue in similar concepts. It's basically a flow chart to both of us. That, and my teen years and my early 20s, it was kind of like, yes, tried social response 54C, related
that's
negative
great.
response, reevaluate, and try with social response 55A.
Okay.
And I
Okay,
think
sounds
it
like an
hit.
Excel sheet.
Basically, it's kind of is. It's an infographic. It's a flow chart in my head. I've just developed enough scripts over the years that it seems seamless.
I think having multiple social responses available to try is key. Because then, okay, I tried one thing and it didn't work, and I still have a few other things to draw upon. And sometimes in play with like people we do feel safe and comfortable with, we can develop these different social responses and see how they go. And so, and if they've gone well, at least when we take it out to the world, if it doesn't go well, it's not quite as devastating, you know. And I think that's really pretty important in terms of how to do it. I do think people tend to disown the parts of themselves. Like they decide at some level that games aren't for them. And, you know, again, we can get into culture on that, but we will. So, yeah. But
Okay.
what are some reasons people might find it difficult to get into games from your perspective, Dr. B?
Well, you know what? I'm gonna talk about my dad for a sec. And I know he's comfortable with me saying this because he's, you know, my dad is to put it perversely, the PTSD poster child. And you know, he grew up with a horrible situation. I won't get into details about that because, you know, it's horrible and it's his. But for him, the idea of unfettered, unstructured play is tremendously anxiety provoking because it's unpredictable. And for him, unpredictable is the same thing as dangerous. And so there can be a lot, you know, that's just one example, but there can be a lot of reasons, those sort of, we talked about being overwhelmed by open-ended options earlier. Well, depending on how people associate with those open-ended options, that can be incredibly anxiety provoking. It can be a sudden loss of any sort of anchor to social framework, cultural framework, anything like that, when you're suddenly thrown into, you know, this into the case of tabletop RPGs, a new world, a new culture. It can be incredibly jarring if you're just suddenly, boom, dropped into it.
Yeah. So one of the other parts on here that we were talking about last time was or not last time, but in our meeting, was externalizing lessons, behaviors from games in the outside world. And there's a couple bullet points to this that I was hoping that you guys would talk over, which is namely the terminology we talked about.
Okay.
Which ones? We dropped a lot of terms.
How do you say it? Schema? Is that it?
Schema.
Yes.
Schema.
Yeah. Schema.
Sounds contagious.
It sounds kind of like the thing from Elder Scrolls.
It's true.
So what is schema?
Well, I think that I'm not going to defer. Okay, Dr. B, I'll take it. For sure.
Yeah.
Let's do it, man.
Do
okay.
it.
So schema is the narrative or story or framework that we create around a thing, right? And so we can either feel we have a story about it in our heads, and it usually dates back to some previous experience that we may have, or some judgment or experience others have laid upon us around whatever it is. So if we're thinking about games, for instance, we may have had the idea that games are somehow immature or infantile, for example, or games and D&D, those are for people who aren't us. Those are for people who are like nerds, and we use maybe negative language to discuss that as opposed to positive language. And we have an idea that somehow that's for whatever reason, people who aren't us. So we have a negative story around it, which interferes with then how we respond when people invite us to maybe take part in games. Or we feel a certain amount of shame and mortification, maybe because gameplay didn't go well. Or I was told I didn't play well with others as a kid, right? So it's all of these stories that then kind of interfere with us being able to just play with some sense of freedom and security. So,
Okay.
Yeah, the beliefs, the beliefs we have about situations. Let me back up for a moment. So when I was trained in a form of psychology heavily called cognitive behavioral therapy. And part of the reason I absolutely love cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is because it's really easy to explain to people at its core that situations don't make us feel a certain way. It's pure input, and it's not just like situation A makes emotion response happen. No, it's our beliefs about the situation that make the emotional output happen. Like Mitra and I might be faced with the same situation, but because we have different beliefs, different associations, different schema, not skooma, as people are bringing up in the chat, but I will say Khajiit has wares if you have coin. But the basically the beliefs and the narratives we have, just they influence our emotional and our behavioral output with a given situation, and that's where play helps us develop our beliefs around things, maybe in our own sense of competence, like Mitra brought up, maybe a sense of cultural norms. When kids are playing, that's often to rehearse cultural norms. And how they do it in different cultures kind of reflects that. And so, developing these beliefs, these schema, these narratives, it's super important. And games and play is a wonderful way to do that.
Before we do the little mid-break to remind viewers of the disclaimer, Mitra, do you want to talk about what you've been alluding to here? Because is this a good point to talk about the cultural differences there?
Oh, for sure. I think it's, well, this is me, so it's never not a good point to talk about culture. But yeah, if you grow up in a non-Western culture, say, or you come into Canada or the US or the UK or wherever, what we consider Euro-Western culture, and you haven't grown up either playing the same games or thinking of games as something that one can do as an adult, um, it can be really difficult to get into play. And when you have different cultural norms that you've grown up with, ideas of how the world works, it can also be difficult. So, I came to Canada in my teens. My first language was English. I grew up reading Tolkien. I kind of had a lot of the sort of, particularly around fantasy and um, not so much games, but particularly around fantasy literature and also films. So I got a lot of the cultural references, but there were many that I missed because I didn't really grow up a lot with TV. These things kind of infuse our game worlds. And so there's this sense of being out of step. And also, when you don't know people terribly well, and when you didn't kind of grow up with them, and when you've had to switch schools a few times, these are all things that really interfere with your capacity to feel safe, and to feel like you can enter into play. So, because of how culturally driven the narratives in games can be, I think that it can be difficult for someone who may want to really engage, to join in. Now, I will say that right now, because of the internet and globalization, you can be in almost any part of the world and you can actually still engage much more in kind of gaming and game culture, which is fantastic. But there are several things related to culture which also interfere in that ability to play, and that is one's home life, judgment and perceptions around games, capacity to be a kid. So some kids end up taking care of their parents or getting parentified, and this is actually true of immigrant parents, immigrant kids, I mean, with parents who've immigrated. They kids often end up do a fair amount of translating, particularly, and this is of course in the literal way, as in they're the native English speakers, and so that's a piece of it. But the other part is just the way the world works. These kids often end up having to be super independent around how they manage their lives outside of the home, because they're the ones who are more fluent in culture outside of the home. So this will both limit their time and energy in terms of gameplay, and this will also limit, because they've kind of had to grow up a little too quickly, this may also make it difficult to get into play.
I'm going to be showing that everything you just said to my dad, because that was him.
Glad to help.
Because of the acculturation issues at the time when my grandparents immigrated from Italy, there was a lot of tension between them speaking their native language. And because I mean, in the early to mid 20th century in the United States, Italians were hated.
Yeah.
You're describing my dad.
Yeah, and to bring actually racism into it, that's big in the sense that um, if I feel that this is a very white space or a very privileged space or a very male space, I probably am not going to feel terribly safe to express myself and to sit down at the gaming table, right? So if I don't feel that sense of representation for whatever
Mm-hmm.
reason, that really interferes with feeling safe to play.
Well, it's another reason session zero is very important for that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's take a quick break to remind viewers and listeners of our disclaimer. Champions Psychology is meant as education and entertainment. It is not a substitute for medical advice or professional counseling. Discussion of mental health topics will be primarily rooted in research and the personal experiences and self disclosures of the hosts. While we can provide generalized education and possible mental health resources, we cannot offer any recommendations, advice, or opinions for any specific persons, cases, or situations. We provide these resources and links at our sole discretion, but have not necessarily vetted or reviewed any resource. We assume no liability for the use of this information or resources on these sites, and we encourage you to use your best judgment. So, the one of the other parts of this that we wanted to go into was the stages of play development, which we have separated as solo play, parallel play, and cooperative play. So I think a couple of those are easy to figure out, but like overall, what do they mean?
Those are some of the, I think, few terms that a lot of mental health professionals use that means exactly what you think it means. It's so awesome. It's not code for anything. It's not like solo play is based on some Phoenician root that means group. The easiest form of play is just playing completely on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And at least from a Western developmental model, because I mean we're talking like Piaget here, and he was pretty rooted in Western European culture. It's often the first to develop, just playing on your own, and then parallel play where you're doing your own thing, but kind of next to each other and occasionally interacting with each other, but you're not building something cooperatively, which is that final stage where you're doing something together for a shared purpose. And for some people, certain forms of this are easier. Again, I'm autistic. I'm real good at parallel play. I am so good at parallel play because there are so many nuances and subtleties that I miss when it comes to cooperative play. I don't know if either of you have ever seen that the Penny Arcade t-shirt where one person is standing astride another one who's got arrows in his back. It's a co-op and I'm winning.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like that sometimes.
Yeah, I think that lots of people do parallel play in ways that they don't, you wouldn't almost just commonly think of it as parallel play. But if you're sitting down with someone and you're each crafting your own thing, or you're painting minis together, it's while you're involved in the crafts, you're also being playful and engaging in a play state in some ways. And you're not, and this can be so much easier. I mean, think of how frequently we all hated group projects in high school or university, and it's like, I know I'm going to do all the editing and the writing. Let's just face it now, right? And so cooperative and shared play can be difficult because there is this state of trust that has to be present for it to go well, and also that sense that this doesn't matter. Right. And that's actually a difficult one to hold for people. It's the idea that, as you say, I'm winning, in this game. But and there is this desire to win.
Yeah.
But when you're in a group, you kind of have to manage within yourself that desire to win with the desire to share the experience, with the desire to ensure no one's left behind,
Mm-hmm.
and with the trust building in the gameplay, and with the ability to set myself aside for the group.
Mm-hmm.
So that, we do enough of that in life sometimes. And so some
Yeah.
people are like, I don't really feel like doing that. So you have to figure out how, particularly in tabletop games, to share the experience and make everyone feel good if you're the DM, but also for players to also allow for each person to have space at the table. So,
I'm gonna bring up a game type that I don't think we've I talked about on the show, which is board games,
mm-hmm.
and how like my group of friends realized at a certain point, like, we hate competitive board games. Like, we just as a group did not enjoy them because, like, even at the end, like, the person that won was like, I don't feel good about that. Like, that's just how my group of friends are. And so the cooperative ones, I can't remember them right now because I haven't gotten to play board games in quite a bit. But I know there's been a few that we've played that were ones where it wasn't us versus each other. It wasn't us versus the board. It was us working together to do something that was a game. And those were probably some of the most fun I had there. Like, I guess, like, in the end, no, I think a good example of this is actually the Sherlock Holmes consulting detective ones. It's board game light because you're mostly reading out loud and everything,
Mm.
which was not great for me. But it presents you as you are all the Sherlock's irregulars. I think that's what they're called. Like the orphans that were around the street that, like, he'd be like, all right, go find out information about it. Here's some money. And so you're kind of going against Sherlock, but that's more of like, this is an impossible way to play the game because Sherlock cheats. So we're all working together. We're reading these clues. They give you newspapers and stuff, and we're cooperatively working towards deciding, what how the crime happened and who the person is. And then at the end, we all find out we're wrong because Sherlock figured it out on step 3 and we're on step 30. Um, but it's like I enjoyed those ones where we weren't working against each other. We weren't stressing out because, oh, we gotta do this before the we flip that card and then everything's terrible. We're just working together to do something fun with a board game. I enjoyed those the most.
And there's a lot of really good cooperative,
Mm.
given I periodically teach clinicians and teachers how to use applied games. I'm always on the lookout for cooperative analog games because a lot
Mm-hmm.
of times teachers and clinicians are more inclined to do analog games. The Forbidden Island series I
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
love,
those are
or
fun.
the Forbidden Desert, Forbidden
Mm-hmm.
Island, basically the Forbidden series. Um, got a Hanabi. Hanabi is an interesting
Mm.
one where you have to try and collaboratively build a fireworks show based on the cards in your hands, but you can't see the cards in your hands. You can only see the cards in other people's hands because you hold them backwards.
Mm.
Yeah, there's a, I always love recommending people go to their friendly local game store to get some suggestions for cooperative play because it cooperative play games really do have a different vibe to
Mm-hmm.
them. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I joke about how many fist fights almost broke out in my 20s when we played Pretty Princess dress up game because it did. That tiara, we almost got in some fist fights over that tiara, but because I am the prettiest princess.
You
But
definitely are.
yeah, cooperative games just have a very different vibe, and I think if you're doing tabletop games like D&D, right, it is cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the idea in that the problem with competitive games is that if people already don't feel so safe at the table, because they feel inexperienced or not as good, or maybe they've had bad experiences with competitive games, then it can be really quite terrifying
Mm-hmm.
to step into another competitive game. Um, and there's another piece that can come into it. For example, as an only child who was not particularly privileged in that role, because of life experience, um, I still found it really difficult with competitive games because I felt like the people in my life ought to be on my side. And this was really So I had to really work on my capacity to be a good loser. Let's
Mitra,
say
I'm
it.
not gonna lie. As another only kid, well, growing up only kid, like I understand that.
So I took it very personally. I'm way better about it now. I will say this, but I will say I also prefer good cooperative games because it's fun to work with people, and I think that's the best part. Like you're working on different skills. When you're playing a competitive game, maybe you are playing in the context of being part of a team, which is great. Because then you're actually getting the cooperative piece as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something powerful about learning to lose and learning to feel comfortable losing and not taking losing so seriously because it's a game,
Mm-hmm.
right? And being able to hold that reality, it is a game. It really will be okay, and you can try again. And that's great. But when you play cooperative, you're also learning more about your group, your
Mm-hmm.
team, your people, their strengths, your strengths. And it can feel a lot safer. So,
Uh, I,
Absolutely.
I think a little bit part of this with like the competitive thing is why I'm bad at Magic the Gathering. Because when I play that game, and I have way too many cards up here, but anyhow, I enjoyed building a deck in that game, and when I would sit down and play against someone, I was looking to like for the experience of it, for like how long the game would go on. It's like, oh, we're 7 turns in, and now I did this, and that changed everything up. And it was the experience of the game, and it took me, and I'm not kidding, years to realize the other person sitting across from me just wanted the game to be over as fast as possible. And I was like,
Mm.
oh, I'm not playing this for the same reason everyone else is. And that's kind of why
mm,
I stopped playing, because I was there to kind of do the parallel play, I guess, where I'm like, we're both playing this game, but we're
mm-hmm,
just, we're just doing stuff at the table and experiencing what are the cards that we have and the decks that we made. But everyone else that I was playing against, their whole, well, actually my wife, she played the same way, where she was like, I just want to build up this army. I don't care what you're doing. I just want to build up this army. And then when I got against people who were like, oh, this is a 3-turn deck, I'm like, that doesn't sound fun. So
yeah.
I think that was something I had there where I'm like, I was looking for parallel play, but it was a competitive play.
Yeah.
Yeah. Player motivations it's an important area it's an important thing to consider. And I'm going to bring it back to tabletop role-playing games for that. I mean, if you think about different player motivations, if you have a mismatch of that, that's where you start to get tension at the table.
Mm,
And I love telling people there's no right way to play a tabletop role-playing game. There's no wrong way to play a tabletop role-playing game. But when you have mismatched player expectations, then you get tension at the table and frustration. And that's no judgment. It just may not be a good fit for everybody.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with an all murder hobo game. But if you've only got one murder hobo and everybody else is there about the social cooperation and the exploration
Yeah.
and all of that, it's going to create tension unless you
Mm-hmm.
find a way to sort of resolve that. And once again, this is why I think a session 0 is so important to sort of establish those player motivations in a way that certain competitive games don't always do.
I think the way to say it would be something like, there's no right or wrong way to play tabletop RPGs, but there is a right and wrong group for you.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Actually, Dark Cyril put it really nicely in the chat. There's no wrong way to do it, but there are incompatible ways.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Like sometimes it's a bad personality fit or whatever, and those player motivations become really important.
Do either of you have anything more on types of play, or should we check out the chat? Yeah. All right. Looks like we're checking out chat.
Check out the chat.
Let's check out chat.
So
Hello,
let's see.
people.
We're doing this in order of
Hey.
appearance that our wonderful mod Jay put in the text document. Starchaser43 says, anyone else remember Lauren saying that she would record reading the disclaimer? She must be really busy with other things. Or I've forgotten to reach out to her. I even had her on difficulty class this week, and we totally forgot to talk about that.
If it's Lauren reading it, I will expect some sort of soundtrack.
Oh.
Ooh, that's a good idea.
I would expect some sort of woodwind overture.
Well, to be fair, Star Chaser says she must be really busy with things. Yeah, like, starting a new job.
Just a little bit.
A little bit.
So happy to have her.
Same. Let's see. Star Chase 43 says, I can identify with not being a wayfarer like Mitra. A family joke is, when you tell Star to go right, be sure to tell him which right. But I found so many wonderful locations because of it. I don't mind. that was actually something that my grandfather and his sister had, where like they would go on a road trip. And he'd come back with stories of, like, his sister would be like, all right, take the right up there, but she meant 2 rights up ahead, and he thought it was the next right. So they just, I don't know why they took road trips. They just yelled at each other the whole time.
Yeah, and one thing to add. So that's wayfinding, and there are studies to show that wayfinding is genetic. And I am using this excuse for the rest of my life, just to be clear. Some people are just innately better at it than others.
So what you're saying is some of us are just born lost.
Some of us like to wander. We're not exactly lost, to paraphrase Tolkien. But I will say that this little device is great because I now have my map on it, and it can tell me where to go, and I can zone out and just go left like it says, and it even has the arrow pointing which way that is, and so it's all good.
Oh no, when I got my Apple Watch and it started sending those notifications, like it would like tap my wrist and be like, hey, you got to write up at it. It would show me there. I'm just like, oh, thank God, I'm a 30-year-old man that still has to look at his hands to do this.
Hey, we all have our challenges.
I no joke. We'll be playing Destiny with my friends, and I'm like, all right, the enemy went right.
But which right? Is it this way? Who the hell knows? Anyway.
Let's see. Eldoin says, for those in long-term games, do you recommend revisiting a session 0, setting a periodic times? I'm actually going to, Dr. B is nodding his head. I'm actually going to give a shout out to Justice Armin. If you do not follow him on Twitter, I highly recommend going and follow him right now. I believe it's just at Justice Armin. And what he does is this brilliant thing where he sends out surveys to his players periodically through a campaign, and he calls them check-ins, and they'll have things on there. It's like, hey, how do you feel the story is developing? How do you feel your character story is developing? Are you comfortable with what has happened so far? And it's just checking in with them to see how they're feeling, not only about the game story, but the game itself and their comfort in it. With everyone, and I love that. The first time I saw that was a mind-blowing moment.
This is where I actually think I thank my training in cognitive behavioral therapy for my style as a DM, because within cognitive behavioral therapy, it's supposed to be a collaborative, empirical exploration, and so you check in with the other person all the time, get feedback on how the therapy sessions are going, and that made its way into my D&D playing as well, of like, yes, please fill out this form, and how's, basically same thing like Justice does. I do informal, in some cases formal check-ins as a way of revisiting that session 0 mentality.
Like it.
Check-ins are important.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Raccoonius, I love that. That's a great name. D&D helped a friend with anxiety problems. She used her character to do things and talk in a way that she would never do in real life, and it prepped her for doing those talks in the future. And yeah, that I know plenty of people that have done this. One of the things, my co-host of Difficulty Class, Allie Deichman, she and I used to run games at a bookstore, and a lot of times it was kids. Most of the time, the majority of it was kids from either 9 to like 14. And a lot of times those kids would just be like, I'm just using this as an excuse to be a terrible person. And then Allie and I went, cool, let's introduce you to real life consequences. It's like, I hit this dude over the head with a chair. I'm like, the town guard has arrived. But the thing is, like, I always appreciated the kids that like I remember this one kid so specifically because he just absolutely blew me away because he showed up, this shy, timid, like textbook D&D nerd from the 80s. Like he looked like he was ripped out of Stranger Things. And he sits down at the table and he's all nervous, he's looking around and everything, and then as soon as we got into the game, just complete switch of personality, and he's like, I'm here, I'm loud and I'm doing things and I'm leading, and I was like, this is amazing. And I loved that.
Well, one of the things I'll say to that, and I've seen this numerous times with the social skills groups that I used to run, and I'll say it even from my own experience, again being autistic. So normal social interactions are freaking weird, man. There's so many unspoken rules that, you know, even if somebody sits down and tries to tell you all the rules, they're gonna miss some of the house rules that nobody really discusses. Whereas a game like Dungeons and Dragons or other tabletop RPGs, there's an established, agreed upon social framework, as well as a safety from real life consequences that allows that exploration in a way I can't walk into my local store and, you know, start shouting shopkeep ice cream now and throw coins at them. I just can't do it.
And it's so much fun to be able to do it somewhere, you know. I think these established upon rules in games, that's what really helps in terms of play and also confidence, because it also helps us examine this idea of the schemas, narratives, norms, stories that we tell about ourselves and culture and about how culture works, which is why it's so confusing for people when they move from one culture to another, because we have a lot of cultural literacy and fluency in one place, and then we move elsewhere and we just, you know, we may have lost that. We can move across from Eastern Canada to Western Canada, and as many of the people I've worked with know, that's a different world. Even though it's the same language, it's the same culture, it's the same media that we're consuming, and yet it's still different. So, yeah.
This is I'm gonna mess this up and I apologize now. Darogadi. I'm gonna go with that. Darogadia. Random question: is schema in the context of CBT going to be the same as I learned schema going into sign language interpretation? I.e., schema is your previous experience and knowledge that informs your reaction understanding of a situation.
I mean,
I'll go with that.
I don't know the sign language training, but based on that definition, sounds pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
Let's see. Dragon Girl 81 says, how does one talk to a therapist about how tabletop RPGs have helped online friends, have helped one's social interactions in real life, when they are of the mindset that you cannot make real friends or experiences in a play space?
Oh God. Okay. I get so tired of therapists who don't get it. I really do. And I'm really sorry that, that's the experience you're having. I think that talking to one's therapist about what has been helpful generally is an important thing. And, countering, if you continually come up against their own biases, that's really tough, because I would imagine it's tougher to feel safe in the therapeutic environment. So you're not responsible for your therapist's education and awareness.
Yeah.
What I will say on sort of an optimistic note is there seems to be a growing number of especially early career mental health professionals who are embracing geek and gamer culture as a sort of subculture unto themselves. And when I look for a therapist, which I recently have been because pandemic stresses, I make sure to look for someone who isn't going to demonize unreasonably the things that I love and bring me joy. Um, yeah, I try and look for someone who kind of understands things from my worldview. I view it as almost akin to cultural competence.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing to stress when you are speaking with a therapist about this is this is what this experience, games, whatever it is that is your experience, this is why it's been important to me. And your therapist better be listening at that point,
Yeah.
really, because their job is to help you recognize the things in your life that you experience as resources, because those are the things that are going to help bridge out to managing and coping with more challenging experiences.
Yeah.
So one of my supervisors, very early in my work, I was just starting to see clients under much supervision. And I think it was my second client at the time who played a lot of World of Warcraft. And in some ways, this was taking away from his life experience, you know, with family and other people. But at the same time, it was also bringing a great deal. And so I remember chatting with my supervisor about this. And the first thing he said was, ask him about his character. And I want to tell you, my supervisor was probably nearly 70 at that point and had no experience with games, video games, as far as I could tell himself. And in fact, I used to regularly help him fix his MacBook Pro. But here he was saying, "Hey, I notice this thing is important,
Mm-hmm.
and work with that. That is your leverage every time with
Yeah.
people." So I put that out there.
I'm genuinely surprised to hear that. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be, but like, I guess like my brain is like, okay, I can understand some therapists not understanding tabletop RPGs. That's still something that's like still coming to, you know, the main spotlight and everything for everybody to understand. But the online friends not being real, that one kind of blows my mind. That there's still people that are thinking that. Like, I remember in high school with Halo 2, my grandfather did not understand that how that worked. He's like, those are not real friends. So one day after school, you know, he'd always ask me, how was school? And I told him two stories about two friends, and I said, which one was the online friend?
Ooh, I love that. Microphone drop.
And after that, he's just like, okay,
Amen.
well played. Yeah, that's kind of surprising. Next one, mom 23rds says Animal Crossing with friends equals parallel play, and from what you have been talking about, I think that is pretty accurate.
Yes, and I will say I do a fair amount of that.
I will also say there are ways of it sort of verging into cooperative.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like if you are there was a time a little, actually not long after the game came out last March, where what's that?
I think I know what you're talking about.
We had a friend who had a birthday, and one of our friends who played the game said, we're going to get him a birthday present, and we're all going to contribute a part to it, and we're going to allow him we're going to give him the mech to put on his island.
Nice.
Yeah, it took a lot of gold. But we all did that. We collaborated, we coordinated, and it became this community cooperative activity that we were participating in order to help our friend have a really good birthday. We helped decorate his island, and it was very much cooperative.
That is way more wholesome than what I thought you were talking about, because like it's still wholesome, but like how after the game came out with turnip prices, like the fact that there were people on Twitter, like freaking Elijah Wood was just going to people's islands to like sell turnips, and it's like that's amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think that Animal Crossing is probably the closest to parallel play, and like Stardew Valley's kind of close in there, but I think that goes more into the cooperative because you all are working towards something in game that is like a checkbox to do. But yeah, I absolutely I love those games. Let's see. Bay Billy G underscore 2000 says, how many arguments have happened over Monopoly? 100%. That is not.
God.
Do not.
Yeah.
Do not bring that into a bad situation.
Oh yeah,
No,
no.
you don't do business with your family, and
Yeah.
Monopoly combines the worst of everything.
Oh my
I
goodness.
mean, he's not the greatest of people to bring up on this show, but I still love the Dane Cook joke. Where'd you get the pink 20s, Grandma? Let's see. Trying to.
I see one that I
Oh
think.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So Bakery Dragon asks if there are any thoughts on tips on when there is that disagreement with therapist about something being important or helpful, and they've had an experience so bad it felt like gaslighting. Um, okay, so bottom line, because I can't advise on specifics and I wouldn't want to, but bottom line is therapy is about the relationship, your relationship with the therapist, and the relationship needs to be a source of healing in your life. It needs to maybe mirror something that was missing in your life experience. And of course, it can be about just, it can even be a little bit about, getting the right push to try something new or to take risks. So, um, when there's something that's important to you or not sitting right with you, with your therapist, and you're feeling less safe with them, the first thing to do is to talk to them about it. And that's it can be difficult to confront a therapist because they might seem like an authority figure, but they are working for you.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom line, they are working for you. And so they need to work for you and to support you and to help you see something more clearly. And if there's something they're seeing that you aren't, great, but it needs to be expressed in a way that feels safe for you. So if something's coming up and you're feeling gaslit or blamed by your therapist, it's really important to address that. So,
Love it. I think that is a good place to stop today's discussion. Mitra, Dr. B, where can people find you on social media?
So I'm at Mitra Jordan, as it says so right there. I'm also, I have a website, mitrajordan.com, so I'm pretty easy to find online. And there aren't a lot of Mitra Jordans around, as I often say, so it should be pretty easy.
Dr. B?
And I can be, I mean, I always say follow Take This Org on all the socials because that's where most of my work is being done. But if you want to follow me personally, there is my socials on the Twitters, on the Instagram, though I'm very rarely on the Instagram.
And for audio listeners, that is the Dr. B with an extra E in the V.
Oh, yeah. I suppose I could say that as well. The Dr. B, spell out doctor.
You can find me on Difficulty Class Podcast every Friday and Champions of Lore every Monday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on twitch.tv/CNE Games. And I'm also on Twitter at the Treavor. There is an A hiding in there. I would like to thank Jay for moderating in the chat. As always, you do a fantastic job and literally would not be able to pull out all these questions without you. And thank you to Codename and Take This for giving us an opportunity to have these discussions. As a heads up for people that are live with us right now, Bardic Inspiration is happening an half hour early today. So 12:30 Pacific Standard Time, that will be going on. Jason will be making some amazing music as he always does. So please hang out and join that because that's just in under 30 minutes. If you're not live with us, we'd love to see you here in the chat next week. Again, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on twitch.tv/CNE Games on Tuesday. But until then, take care of yourself.